From 1775 to 1781, the British Army's operations in America show the British High Command grabbing at straws strategically, formulating a plan for victory in Massachusetts in 1775, only to change it in 1776 with the New York campaign, and then abandoning the 1776 plan in 77 to target Philadelphia, and then changing course again in 78 with Clinton's Southern campaign, and then forsaking the Southern campaign scheme in 1781 in search of a decisive victory in Virginia. These shifts in geographic focus represented a conceptual shift in strategy from trying to pacify the Americans through economic asphyxiation to targeting their army for decisive battle, to then conquering territory and shoring up loyalist local governments, to then again switching to seeking a decisive battle. At each stage and in every location, in every theater of the war, British strategy expected and depended on strong on strong loyalist support in a given area, in the middle colonies, southern colonies, the Trans-Appalachian West. And so the British Army traveled from colony to colony in search of, or from theater to theater, in search of loyalist manpower that could make its war plans feasible. They needed, the war plans counted on loyalist support. Okay? And so they went to these different theaters to find that loyalist support that would make the war plans operable. But this loyalist groundswell just never materialized. It remains for historians to determine whether loyalist support was effectively intimidated and suppressed by the Patriots' effective control of local town governments and local militias, or whether it was never there to begin with. But what is apparent is that British policymakers were trapped in a misunderstanding of the conflict. They believed that the Patriot opposition movement was a radical and fringe element, when in fact, the revolutionists' understanding of English law, the imperial constitution, the way the empire was constituted, and their understanding of Parliament's lawlessness was in fact not fringe, not radical, but quite conventional and widespread in America. Okay, so the Patriot cause was not fringe, but mainstream. Okay. Only in 1781 did the imperial government finally comprehend that it would not find loyalist support in America, and that winning the war without the colonists, without loyalists, was beyond Britain's financial capabilities. Now, the Americans had their own serious manpower challenges after the disastrous campaign of 1776, but they always had these immense manpower reserves in the towns, in local militia. Okay, so yes, the Continental Army had serious problems filling its ranks, but they had virtually unlimited reserves in the militia. And not only did these militiamen serve as combatants alongside the Continental Army at times, they also did combat on their own in their localities against loyalist militias, against Indians, and even against British redcoats themselves. The ubiquitous presence of Patriot militias in the countryside forced the British Army to approach foraging expeditions as foraging campaigns. Okay, they were much larger than traditional foraging expeditions. And this was because these British foraging parties required heavy military protection because Patriot militias were everywhere. which meant that these foraging parties had limited range and limited speed and limited effectiveness in terms of how much they could gather, because they required so much protection and were always on guard. Okay? And so it reduced the effectiveness of British foraging expedition, and it put an extra strain on British manpower allocation. And as essential as militias were in the field militarily, they were the key to Patriot civic control in countless American towns and villages. The local administrative control in thousands of communities throughout the country enabled Patriots to sustain the Continental Army with provisions and recruits over the course of 8 long years of the war. And as important, this civic control of the towns, of the countryside, helped the Patriots deny the British Army these same valuable resources of manpower and supplies. So ever since the Revolution, historians have debated the relative roles of the army and the militia in securing American victory and independence. Like, who was responsible for winning the war, the army or the militia? Back then, during the Revolution and in the decades that followed, in the late 18th century and early 19th century, back at a time when Americans believed that the war was won thanks to Patriot majorities in the colonies, it was widely understood that it was the militia that had won the war. In the 20th century, when scholars came to believe that America owed its independence not to a broad Patriot support in the citizenry, but rather that victory or that independence was the product of a relatively small and supremely dedicated Patriot minority, that only 20 or 30% of Americans were committed to the Patriot cause, then Americans naturally transferred the laurels of victory from the militia, from this widespread organization, to the Continental Army, which was a small cadre of soldiers. Therefore, when 20th century historians and lay people consider the Revolutionary War today, they're focused primarily on the National Army's operations and are generally dismissive of the militias. And this has been so for about 100 years or so. Okay, historians and the rest of us following them, when we study the war, we study the Continental Army, and we kind of smirk at the militia. Okay? And this is reflected in both academic and popular histories, as well as in museum exhibits and documentaries and literature and movies, etc. The fact that the weight of scholarship nowadays is once again swinging in favor of Patriot majorities throughout the 13 colonies, I assume will lead scholars in the coming decades to once again reassess and highlight and give due credit to Patriot militias as indispensable to American victory, in the war. And it highlights the fact that this question, who won the war, the army or the militia, has never really been about history. Okay? Rather, this historical question has always been about, and still today is about, how Americans should run their country today. Okay? And this is something that's true in history in general. Most people study history not to learn obscure things about the past, but to understand the present better. Okay? And so this question about who won the war back then and today has been a kind of stand-in for a debate that Americans have always had and still are having about how to run this country. The militia and the army, the militia on the one hand, the army on the other, are emblems of two different administrative systems in the United States. The state governments on the one hand, and the national government on the other. And these two administrative systems, state and federal government, have been competing with one another since the birth of the Republic. In the 2+ centuries that followed the Revolution, Americans have been engaged in this fierce, continuous contest over the proper roles and jurisdictions and competing narrative and powers of the federal and state governments. So when Americans were offered an explanation about the revolution, an explanation that highlighted the role of the Continental Army, or an explanation that highlighted the role of the militias, these explanations illustrated the political and administrative principles that the two sides championed in their debates about federal power versus state power. So the debate about who won our founding war was a representation of the debate that people were having in the 1890s and in the 1880s and 1890s, and in the early in the 1780s and 1790s, and in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, and in the late 19th century, and throughout the 20th century, about which political system should we have. One that is led by the federal government, or one that is led by state governments. So in this context, in the context of the debate that we've been having for 250 years over big government and small government, an effective militia was the backbone of the narrative, or say it this way, in the narrative of the war, in which the militia was the backbone of the war effort, that narrative served Americans in the early Republic as a testament to the efficacy of democratic civic institutions, local democratic civic institutions. Okay, that narrative, again, with the militia as the backbone of the war effort, taught that the states had led the war effort and won the war. And therefore, the states should take the lead in administering public life in the young republic. By contrast, the 20th century narrative of the war, which is a narrative of a feckless militia and a strong Continental Army, this narrative was a testament to the need for professional expertise to run important national projects, important executive bodies. This narrative taught that the national government had won the war, and therefore that the national government should direct public policy in this country. In the early republic, advocates of states' rights largely won this ideological, political, and public relations battle. So it should come as no surprise then that Americans in that era, living as they did in a states' rights republic, largely judged the militias favorably as the bulwark of American independence. By contrast, since the late 19th century, since the progressive era, from the 1890s to today, the United States has evolved, transformed from a states' rights republic into a modern managerial nation state, okay, in which states' rights have receded in the face of growing federal power. So again, it should come as no surprise that during this time, Americans have shifted their historical understanding of the Revolutionary War, determining that the Continental Army had won the war rather than the militias. So that's the American debate about who won the war. Okay. There's also an international debate about who won the war, and in this that debate goes as follows. So there are two. So again, on the national front, the American front, who won the war? The army or the militia, the national government or the state governments, or I guess the people. On the international front, there are again two conflicting views, interpretations, narratives of the War of Independence. Americans of the Revolutionary era and the early Republic believed that they had won the war on the strength of, as I said before, on the strength of overwhelming public support for the Patriot cause throughout the 13 colonies. By contrast, most historians in the modern era, in the 20th century, again, I mentioned this before, believe that only about 20 or 30% of Americans were, supported the revolution. And so the victory seems more surprising and more miraculous. And these historians give a lot of credit for American victory to, on the one hand, to that small cadre, that small minority of Americans, but also, of patriots who kind of exerted their will on the majority of Americans who were either wishy-washy or against. But also, these historians give a lot of credit for the American victory to America's allies, to the French and the Spanish, for joining the war and forcing the British to deploy their forces in Europe and the West Indies, and kind of making the American war a global war, and thereby exhausting the British and depleting them and bringing the British to their knees. That given the fact, well, as I explained, okay. So as I said, more recent scholarship, including scholarship by an excellent former graduate student of mine, by the name of David Smith, is rehabilitating the original assessment of the war, which understood the military victory as a product of the rebels' decisive manpower advantage. That the rebels had overwhelming popular support. It wasn't 20 or 30%, it was anywhere from 55 to 75% support in each and every state. Okay, so, and that of course paints the victory in the war as less miraculous and therefore less dependent on French or Spanish support. And David's dissertation should be out as a book, hopefully in the next year or two, and so you'll be able to see the data for yourselves. But in any case, there's David's dissertation seems to be a part of a shift in the narrative. So we've had one narrative of the war for about 100 years, from independence to about the late 19th century, and then a new interpretation of the war for about 100 years from the late 19th century to roughly today. And it seems that the weight of scholarship is, again, like I said, rehabilitating the original understanding of the war. And like I said before, these findings are crucial for understanding the war militarily, but they also shed light on the nature of the revolution itself. The fact that Patriot support ran so deep indicates that revolutionist ideology and constitutional beliefs were not radical, but conventional. They were mainstream in America and, in fact, in the Anglo-American world, even in England. Then in the American theater of operations, Patriots, and this is what David Smith's research documents, Patriots enjoyed a clear and decisive manpower advantage, well over 2-to-1. And they enjoyed this manpower superiority well before the French entered the war. Okay, this was not a product of the French and then the Spanish globalizing this war. Even when it was just an American war, the Americans had a tremendous manpower advantage. And this represented a manpower crisis for the British because their military plans in each and every region hinged on their expectations to recruit provincial troops, loyalists, to support the British regulars, as they had done in previous imperial wars. Okay, and this never happened anywhere. And so while the rebels regularly replenished their forces after costly battles and campaigns, British manpower losses had lasting detrimental effects, even in successful campaigns. Even when they were successful, they couldn't replenish manpower that they lost. So this reassessment of American support for the Patriot cause can solve two problems, or two issues that people have had with the war. Sorry. First of all, it addresses this international debate about who won the war. Did Americans win the war, or did the French and Spanish win the war? When you understand the Patriot cause as a minority cause in America, it lends credence to the idea that the French and Spanish were crucial to the war effort. By contrast, when you see the American cause, when you see the Patriot cause as a vast majority in the American population, it naturally downgrades the credibility of the argument that France and Spain were crucial for victory. But also, this reassessment of the Patriot cause in America addresses use the word problem, but it's not a problem, it's a accusation, I guess, that some people approach the war with. Number one, British commanders for about a century, maybe more, have been criticized by generations of mystified military historians for being overly cautious during the American War. But again, this caution on the part of British commanders is a head scratcher only if you believe that Patriot support in America was low. In the context of the new data, if you believe it, about broad public support for the revolution and weak loyalist support, we can see Britain's manpower, we can see that Britain's manpower deficiencies were completely crippling. Britain's inability to draw on American military manpower repeatedly hampered their logistical and tactical operations from the very beginning of the war. Okay. And from that point on, British tactical defeats, like for example at Saratoga in 77 and Kings Mountain in 1780, made this manpower crunch even more crippling. Okay, it exacerbated it. Okay? But the point is that these defeats in the field did not create the manpower problems that the British had. The British had these manpower problems from the very beginning, before they suffered their first major defeat. Okay? So the British were losing the war on the logistical front well before France entered the war and expanded the war effort to Europe and the Caribbean, and it was losing the war on the logistical front before they suffered their setbacks in the field in the north or in the south. And so the caution of British commanders should be understood in this context, that they understood that the rebels could lose 500 men and replace them tomorrow. Whereas if the natural, the normal degradation of British manpower was irreversible. Okay, so they dared not risk their men unless they had a written guarantee that this was a surefire success, this battle or this pursuit. That's number one about the accusation that they were too cautious. The second complaint, or again, people wonder why the Americans didn't employ guerrilla tactics. And again, if this course of action might make sense if you conceive of the Patriots as a small minority in America. Okay? But with the new data, the Americans' overwhelming advantage in manpower or manpower reserves makes their choice of fighting a conventional war against Britain self-explanatory. Of course, everyone understood back then and today that guerrilla tactics are the weapons of the weak, or the tactics of the weak, strategy of the weak. There we go. And in terms of manpower, the Americans were not weak; they were the strong. Okay? So the war started and ended as a conventional 18th century war of attrition. And wars of attrition always have, always will, favor the side with greater manpower resources. Okay? So when you consider the new data about manpower, the American manpower advantage, it makes complete sense. You don't have to scratch your head about why the Americans didn't employ guerrilla tactics. Okay? They had the advantage. Okay? The British lost this contest because of logistical, financial, and political exhaustion, rather than by losing major battles. Okay? And that is because, again, the American strategy of fighting a conventional 18th century war of attrition matched the resources that they could bring to the war.